Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we unpack complex ideas, extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, and, well, make you well-informed, fast. Today, we're plunging into the fascinating world of systems, particularly the unexpected ways they can trip us up, or, as our source material brilliantly calls them, system traps.
That's an excellent way to put it. We're really zeroing in on why things often go sideways in complex situations. And it's often not because people are foolish, or have bad intentions. It's because the very structure of the systems we design, or maybe just inhabit, can inadvertently lead to problematic behaviors. And for you, the listener, navigating the intricate systems of software engineering, from sprawling microservice architectures to complex project life cycles, and the delicate dynamics of engineering teams, understanding these traps offers, I think, really profound insights that helps you see the underlying forces at play.
Right, seeing beyond the symptom to the root cause.
Exactly, beyond the immediate symptom to the systemic root.
Our compass for this deep dive is Donella Meadows' seminal work, Thinking in Systems, a primer, skillfully edited by Diana Wright. This book is, frankly, it's a masterclass in understanding how everything is interconnected and how the often invisible forces of system structure drive observable behavior. We're going to be focusing extensively on Chapter 5 today, where Meadows lays bare these common system archetypes, these recurrent, predictable patterns of problematic behavior. They show up everywhere, don't they? Economies, ecosystems.
Oh, absolutely. Everywhere. And certainly within any large-scale software development endeavor, you see them all the time if you know what to look for.
So what's our mission today?
Our mission today is to thoroughly dissect these system traps, unpack their underlying mechanisms, and critically, to illuminate the powerful opportunities they present for intervention and, maybe even more importantly, redesign. We'll try to leave no stone unturned, really elaborating on every facet of these powerful concepts. We want to ensure you grasp not just what these traps are, but why they occur, and, crucially, how they can be addressed or even transformed.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of system traps then. Meadows describes them as remarkably common, strikingly similar patterns of problematic behavior. And the key thing, as you said, is they arise not from the individuals nor from random events, but from the system's inherent built-in structure. Why is that distinction so crucial?
It's absolutely crucial because our default inclination, when faced with a problem, is almost always to blame either the individual, that team lead is incompetent, or those developers are lazy, or maybe attribute it to some random unavoidable external event, like, oh, the market shifted. But Meadows shakes us out of that thinking. She shows that these problems aren't just isolated incidents or character flaws. They are archetypes, recurrent, predictable patterns.
Yeah.
So the standard responses, like demanding more effort or imposing stricter rules, they simply will not fix structural problems. They don't address the root cause embedded in the system's design.
Right, you're just treating the symptom again.
Exactly. But the good news, and this is really empowering, is that by recognizing these traps for what they truly are, you identify profound opportunities to alter the structure itself, maybe by reformulating the system's fundamental goals, or by weakening, strengthening, or even adding entirely new feedback loops to guide behavior in a more desirable direction. It empowers you to go beyond just patching symptoms.
Okay, let's dive into our first trap then. This one's called policy resistance, often known as fixes that fail. This is when you try to fix a situation, maybe year after year, throwing more resources or new regulations at it, only to be met with this stubborn, almost intractable resistance from the system itself. You put in monumental effort, but see very little, if any, real improvement. It's like trying to push on a rope, isn't it?
That's a perfect analogy. The harder you push, the more it just bunches up without moving forward. And what's truly fascinating about policy resistance is that it typically arises when different subsystems within a larger system, or maybe different actors within those subsystems, have goals that are either inconsistent or often directly contradictory.
Ah, okay. So conflicting goals are key here.
Yes. Imagine a central stock, maybe something like the drug supply on city streets. You have multiple actors involved, addicts trying to maintain their supply, pushers aiming for optimal pricing, not too high, not too low, enforcement agencies trying to keep the supply at zero, average citizens seeking safety from drug-related crime. All these actors are trying to pull that single stock, the drug supply, in different, often opposing directions.
So it's a constant tug of war.
Precisely. And the underlying mechanism is a classic balancing act that almost inevitably leads to a stalemate. When one actor gains an advantage, say, enforcement agencies manage to cut drug imports at the border, thereby reducing the supply, what happens? Well, the others immediately double their efforts to pull the stock back towards their own desired state.
So the system pushes back.
Right. Street prices for drugs might rise sharply. What does that do? It incentivizes drug dealers to find new, more sophisticated ways to smuggle drugs. And addicts. They might be compelled to commit more crimes to afford their now more expensive fixes. This creates a perpetual standoff. Despite monumental effort from all sides, the central stock, the drug supply, doesn't end up much different than before. And critically, no one achieves their desired outcome. Meadows highlights that this can operate in a ratchet mode, where intensifying one's effort just leads to everyone else intensifying theirs in response. It makes it incredibly difficult to de-escalate. It's a real lose-lose scenario where energy is just expended to maintain a frustrating equilibrium.
The source gives some really vivid examples of this frustrating dynamic. You see it with farm programs and gluts. Agricultural policies have tried to reduce overproduction for decades, but, well, persistent gluts continue to plague the market. That indicates a deep-seated resistance, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's the system resisting the policy.
Similarly, despite huge efforts and costs in the wars on drugs, illicit drugs remain as prevalent as ever on the streets. Investment tax credits. They've been implemented, altered countless times, yet skeptics note little proven benefit to overall economic growth. And perhaps most relatable for many, in the U.S. healthcare system, decades of diverse policies, from cost controls to market-based reforms, have failed to bring costs down. That illustrates a tenacious policy resistance. But why is it so hard to break out of this cycle? It feels like you're just banging your head against a wall.
Well, Meadows offers a really striking historical case study, the Romanian abortion ban of 1967. The government, under the dictator Nicolas Ceausescu, banned abortions for women under 45. The driver was a nationalistic demographic goal: increase the population, and initially it seemed to work. The birth rate did triple. However, Meadows details the policy resistance that quickly set in.
Okay, so what happened?
Despite the law and immense personal risk to the women involved, the birth rate slowly but inexorably returned to previous levels. Why? Primarily due to dangerous, illegal abortions, which tragically tripled maternal mortality. Many unwanted children born under the ban were abandoned orphanages. Romanian families simply couldn't raise more children decently. They lacked resources, space. They resisted the government's pull towards larger family sizes at great personal cost. This was a direct, very human manifestation of a system pushing back against a policy that fundamentally misaligned with the real constraints and goals of its components.
That Romanian example is chilling. It sounds like a system can become resistant out of sheer human will, doesn't it? Just basic needs pushing back.
You're right. It's often about human will and the fundamental drives of the system's components, needs, constraints. So Meadows outlines two primary paths out of this trap. One way is to try to overpower the resistance, as Ceausescu did, through sheer force and unyielding policy enforcement.
The brute force approach.
Exactly. However, that path often leads to monumental resentment within the system. And as history showed with Ceausescu's execution and the immediate repeal of the ban, it can lead to explosive and unpredictable consequences if that power is ever released or overthrown. It's really just a temporary suppression, not a true resolution.
So a Band-Aid solution that just builds pressure underneath.
Right. The alternative is far more counterintuitive for many policymakers: letting go. This means consciously giving up ineffective policies that are clearly being resisted. Allow the resources and energy formerly spent on both enforcing and resisting to be redirected for more constructive purposes.
Letting go. That takes some courage, I imagine.
It does. The end of Prohibition in the U.S. in 1933 is a powerful example. When the ban on alcohol was lifted, much of the associated chaos and crime largely ended. Why? Because the energy previously invested in resistance just dissipated.
But what if you can't just let go? If the problem still needs addressing? Is there a more proactive approach than brute force?
Absolutely. The most effective way, Meadows argues, is to find a way of aligning the various goals of the subsystems, usually by providing an overarching, mutually beneficial goal that everyone can actually pull towards. This transforms the dynamic. It shifts from adversarial tug-of-war to something more collaborative.
Okay, how did that work in practice?
Well, consider Hungary's housing policy around the same time as Romania's ban. Hungary was also worried about its low birth rate. But instead of just banning abortion, they investigated the root causes. They found that cramped housing was a significant limiting factor for families wanting more children. So what did they do? They rewarded larger families with more living space. Now, this policy was only partially successful, but it was far more effective than Romania's disastrous results. Why? Because it addressed a real constraint and aligned with the family's actual needs and desires.
That's a clever approach. It's not just about the numbers, the abstract goal, but the conditions enabling them.
Yes. And a truly exemplary case is Sweden's population policy in the 1930s. Instead of focusing solely on the sheer quantity, the birth rate number, Sweden shifted its goal to the quality of childcare. The overarching goal became every child should be wanted, nurtured, free from material need, and have access to excellent education and healthcare.
That's a very different kind of goal.
Completely different. And their policies reflected that. Astonishingly, during a period of low birth rates, their policies included free contraceptives and abortion because every child should be wanted. They introduced widespread sex education, easier divorce laws, and robust support for families in need. Since then, birth rates have fluctuated, but without causing national panic, because the nation had aligned on a deeper, more important, and broadly acceptable goal for its citizens.
That's a powerful distinction.
Yeah.
Quality over quantity, purpose over mere metrics. Okay, so for a software engineer listening, what's the aha moment here? How does policy resistance manifest in their daily work, maybe in their teams or projects, and how can aligning goals actually help?
Right, the aha moment for software engineers navigating this trap is realizing that many internal conflicts, the kind that feel like constant friction between teams. Maybe the product team wanting features yesterday and the engineering team demanding more robust testing. These aren't just personality clashes. They are often policy resistance in action.
Okay, how so?
Imagine a new, top-down, mandated architectural pattern. Or maybe a rigid development process is introduced without genuinely addressing the conflicting goals or, frankly, the bounded rationality of individual teams or developers. Their local context matters. You might see superficial adoption. Teams outwardly comply, they check the boxes. But the underlying resistance manifests in other ways. Subtle workarounds, increased technical debt that accumulates unseen, maybe persistent project delays as teams struggle to make the new system fit their existing unaddressed needs.
So the resistance goes underground.
It goes underground. The profound insight here is that simply imposing a new policy or process from above will not work if it conflicts with the intrinsic motivations and constraints of the people operating within the system. It just won't stick. The path forward is to step back. Understand the various incentives and disincentives that drive individual team behaviors, and critically seek an overarching goal that all teams can genuinely align with. This might be shared metrics for product success, maybe a unified vision for system reliability, or a collective commitment to customer value. When everyone is genuinely pulling towards the same high-level purpose, you get intrinsic buy-in. You get effective system change rather than just outward compliance that hides deeper resistance.
Fascinating. So the key is not to push harder against the resistance, but to understand the deeper motivations, the conflicting goals, and then align this system toward a shared, meaningful purpose. This can truly unlock a system's potential in ways that brute force never could. Micro recap. You're listening to The Deep Dive, and we're exploring Donella Meadows' powerful insights into system traps from her book, Thinking in Systems. We've just unpacked policy resistance, how attempts to fix problems often fail because conflicting goals within the system create counterpressures. This leads to persistent stalemate and, frankly, a lot of wasted effort. The critical insight here is that true change comes not from forcing compliance, but from aligning goals around a higher shared purpose, like Sweden did for child welfare.
Indeed. The core takeaway is that pushing against system resistance without understanding its structural roots is often futile. It just leads to more effort with no real change. Now let's move on to another really pervasive trap, one that highlights the dangers of shared resources when individual incentives misalign with collective well-being. The tragedy of the commons. Hashtag the tragedy of the commons.
Okay, the tragedy of the commons. Here's where it gets really interesting, I think. This archetype describes situations where a shared, limited, and potentially erodible resource gets overused and ultimately destroyed. Why? Because individual users benefit directly and immediately from its use, but they share the costs of its abuse or degradation with everyone else. Those costs are diffuse, delayed. It's a classic paradox of collective action that can lead to total ruin.
Meadows eloquently defines this as a problem arising from missing, or maybe just too long delayed, feedback. Feedback from the resource itself, its condition, back to the growth or activity of its users. Each user, acting perfectly rationally in their own self-interest within their bounded rationality, meaning making decisions based on the limited information and incentives immediately available to them, sees no compelling reason to limit their use.
So it's about that short-term personal gain outweighing a long-term collective cost that feels distant.
Exactly. As Garrett Hardin famously described with the example of herdsmen adding one more animal to a common pasture, the individual herdsman receives all the direct proceeds from the sale of that additional animal, so the positive utility for them is nearly plus one. However, the negative effects of overgrazing, the pasture becoming barren, are shared by all users. So the negative utility for any particular decision-making herdsman is only a fraction of Memich 1. The rational herdsman, therefore, concludes the only sensible course is to add another animal, and another, and another. This logic, applied by each and every rational herdsman sharing the commons, leads inevitably to ruin for all. The absence of immediate personal consequences for individual actions on the shared resource drives this continued overharvesting until the resource is destroyed. It's a systemic failure where the incentive structure encourages self-destruction.
And we see this everywhere, right? The source gives common examples, and many apply equally to shared resources in the software world, like a shared microservice, or a central build server, or even a common database. Hardin's classic example of overgrazing pasture, where herdsmen continually adding cows, leads to its ecological ruin, the eventual collapse of all herds. Uncontrolled access to national parks, where popularity leads to overuse, degrading trails, wildlife habitats, and the overall visitor experience for everyone. Overfishing, leading to the collapse of once abundant fisheries, like the Grand Banks, because individual boats harvest beyond sustainable limits. And pollution in common sinks. Companies reduce their operational costs by dumping waste into shared air or water, the common sinks, distributing the cost of pollution and environmental degradation to the entire community while reaping private profit.
Meadows points out that this often happens precisely because the individual user receives immediate concentrated benefits, while the costs, the environmental degradation, the resource depletion, are dispersed across the entire community. And they're often delayed, sometimes for years or even decades. The crucial missing link is direct, compelling feedback. Feedback to the individual user about the specific consequences of their own actions on the shared resource. This absence of feedback drives the continued overharvesting or overpollution until the resource is utterly destroyed, making it unavailable to anyone.
So what does Meadows tell us about escaping this tragedy? It seems like a pretty bleak scenario if everyone is just acting rationally in their own short-term interest. How do we fix that missing feedback loop?
It can be bleak, yes. Meadows outlines three primary ways to avoid it, essentially ways to restore that feedback. The first is to educate and exhort. This involves helping people understand the long-term consequences of unrestrained use, appealing to their morality, maybe threatening them with social disapproval, raising awareness.
Okay, the shame them into compliance approach.
Sort of. And while this can be a necessary first step, it often isn't sufficient on its own. It doesn't fundamentally change the economic incentives or the bounded rationality that drives individual behavior. Awareness is good, but usually not enough to change entrenched behavior.
Right.
So what else? The second way out is to privatize the commons. This means dividing the shared resource into private parcels. Each person directly experiences the consequences of their own actions. If someone overuses their private plot of land or their personal allocation of a resource, only they suffer the negative consequences. That provides immediate and direct feedback. However, this approach isn't feasible for many common resources like the atmosphere, oceans, or public roads. You can't easily divide those up.
Which brings us to the third option, right? For resources that can't be privatized.
Exactly. Therefore, the third and often most practical solution is to regulate the commons. Garrett Hardin bluntly called this mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. This involves setting explicit rules, bans, quotas, permits, taxes, or incentives. And critically, these need to be enforced by policing and penalties.
Mutual coercion. Sounds a bit harsh.
It sounds harsh, but think about common examples where it works effectively. Traffic lights. They regulate access to common intersection space, ensuring safety and flow by coercing individual drivers to take turns. You can't just drive through whenever you want, but you accept the rule because it benefits everyone, including you. Parking meters parcel out common parking spaces, charging for use and limiting the time a vehicle can occupy them, making access more equitable and managing demand. Bank barriers and penalties prevent access to financial commons without adherence to strict rules. Broadcasting frequencies are issued by government agencies to avoid chaotic interference. And municipal garbage systems are increasingly charging households based on the amount of waste generated. This directly links cost to usage, transforming what was previously a common sink, where individual costs were diffused, into a regulated pay-as-you-go system. It restores critical feedback. Most people comply with such regulatory systems, Meadows notes, as long as they are mutually agreed upon and their purpose is understood. That's the mutual part.
That makes sense. The mutual part is key. Okay, so for a software engineer, what's the critical takeaway from the tragedy of the commons? Where do we see this play out in our tech systems, and how do we build those crucial feedback loops? Maybe through regulation or privatization?
Right. For software engineers, the tragedy of the commons resonates deeply with managing shared code bases, infrastructure, or even shared attention and operational resources like build queues or testing environments. The aha here is that if you don't build in clear ownership or explicit rules enforced by automated tools, your shared resources are almost guaranteed to degrade over time. It's almost inevitable.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a core logging service that every team uses. Individually, each team adds just a few more log lines, rationalizing it as necessary debug info or just for this one-off case. Seems harmless, right? But cumulatively, those few more lines from every team become terabytes of data. It crushes your log ingestion system, drives up cloud costs enormously, and makes it impossible to find relevant logs when a real crisis hits. That's a classic commons problem in action. The individual benefit is high, the collective cost is hidden until it's too late.
Okay, I've definitely seen that happen.
It's common. So without clear ownership models for specific services or modules, or maybe explicit rules enforced by automated linters ensuring coding standards, code review mandates maintaining quality, or CI/CD gates preventing merges of problematic code. Shared resources like central build times, CI pipelines, or database performance can rapidly degrade. Every team might rationally push their own code or consume resources, but the collective impact of unchecked complexity or resource consumption leads to slower builds, flakier tests, and performance bottlenecks for everyone. The way out here involves implementing strong code ownership, establishing clear service-level agreements, SLAs, for internal tools, or maybe even internal chargeback mechanisms to create direct feedback on resource usage. This incentivizes teams to optimize their consumption rather than externalize costs to the common pool. The goal is always to make the dispersed, delayed costs visible and immediate to the individual actor. That makes perfect sense. Making those invisible costs visible is crucial. It reminds me of how quickly a clean shared office kitchen devolves without a clear cleaning schedule or someone taking ownership. Same principle. Micro recap.
We're continuing our deep dive into system traps from Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. We just delved into the tragedy of the commons, where individually rational actions lead to collective ruin of shared resources. This happens because the feedback loop connecting individual use to the resource's condition is weak or delayed. The critical insight is that effective solutions go beyond just moral appeals. They often involve restoring direct feedback, perhaps through agreed-upon regulation, that mutual coercion or privatization to prevent resource depletion. Absolutely. And now let's explore a trap that hits close to home for many of us, I think, whether it's our personal habits or the slow erosion of standards in a long-running project. Drift to low performance. Hashtag drift to low performance. Okay, drift to low performance. Or eroding goals. Meadows also calls it the boiled frog syndrome, which is quite an image. This trap describes systems that don't just stay bad, but keep getting worse, subtly and continuously, often without anyone truly realizing how far they've fallen until it's really too late. It's a very insidious kind of decay.
The core mechanism here is indeed insidious, and it often plays on our perception. There's usually an initial desired performance goal, right? A standard we aim for. But over time, the actual system state, the current performance, is perceived with a pervasive negative bias. Bad news is believed more readily than good news. The worst results, the failures, they linger in memory, while successes are often dismissed as just aberrations or flukes. Oh, that was a lucky sprint.
We remember the bad stuff more clearly.
Exactly. And consequently, the desired state, or the standards, are subtly allowed to slip downward. You start hearing things like, well, that's about all you can expect from a system like this these days, or we're not doing much worse than last year, given the circumstances, or maybe look around, everybody else is having trouble too. These statements, these rationalizations, become part of a reinforcing loop going downward. The lower the perceived performance, the lower the acceptable standard becomes, which in turn means less corrective action is taken, and so performance continues to decline. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of decay.
So it's not just that things get worse, but our expectations shift downwards, normalizing the decline. That's the scary part. Meadows provides many relatable examples of this slow but persistent erosion. A falling market share in a business where the company continuously lowers its market share targets. They adjust expectations downwards rather than fundamentally changing strategy to regain lost ground. The eroding quality of service at a hospital where standards for patient care slowly decline, maybe due to budget cuts or staff shortages, and the new lower level of service just becomes the accepted norm. continuously dirtier rivers or air, where environmental quality goals are gradually relaxed over time as pollution levels creep up and what was once unacceptable becomes the new normal. Even a personal jogging program that faded away, where fitness goals are slowly abandoned due to a negative bias in perceiving results, I'm not getting faster anyway, and a gradual erosion of commitment.
And this subtle, continuous degradation means that everyone involved is lulled into lower and lower expectations. Meadows points out that this is precisely where that chilling boiled frog metaphor comes in. If you drop a frog into boiling water, it immediately perceives the danger and jumps out. But if you put it in cool water and slowly heat it to a boil, it remains lethargic, adjusts to the rising temperature, and cooks to death without ever perceiving the danger. The gradual, incremental nature of the change makes the decline seem normal and therefore tolerable. It masks the severity of the problem until recovery becomes much harder or maybe even impossible.
That's a powerful and disturbing image. How do we fight against that slow, insidious creep? How do we jump out of the pot before it boils? Meadows must have some antidotes for this one.
She offers two powerful antidotes, ways to actively counter this downward spiral. One is really fundamental. Keep standards absolute, regardless of how current performance fluctuates. Do not let performance standards be influenced by past performance. They should remain fixed, based on an external benchmark or maybe an ideal state, rather than being constantly adjusted based on a biased perception of what's currently achievable.
So no moving the goalpost just because you missed the goal last time.
Exactly. Don't grade on a curve where the curve keeps dropping. Even better, the second antidote suggests you enhance standards with best performances. Instead of focusing on setbacks or just average performance, set goals based on the best past performances. Treat any current setbacks as temporary deviations from a high standard, not the new baseline. This actively transforms the reinforcing loop from a downward spiral into an upward one. It changes the mindset from the worse things get, the worse I'm going to let them get, to something like the better things get, the harder I'm going to work to make them even better. It harnesses the reinforcing feedback for positive growth, for continuous improvement.
That's a great twist. Using the reinforcing loop for good, pulling things up instead of letting them slide down. Okay, for software engineers, what's the aha moment here? How does this play out with things like technical debt, code quality, and how do we implement these antidotes in our teams?
Right. The aha here is that many problems we might attribute to developer sloppiness or maybe lack of care are actually systemic drift to low performance. It's the system dragging itself down. If standards for code quality, rigorous testing, or comprehensive documentation are allowed to erode because we're too busy with new features, or that's just how we do things now in this fast-paced environment, the system will continually drift to lower performance. Guaranteed. This manifests as increasing bugs, slower development velocity, higher cost of change, maybe a general feeling of being stuck in quicksand, unable to move forward effectively.
I can picture that, like a core library becoming a no-go zone for new features because its maintainability standards have just eroded year after year.
Precisely. The team's implicit standard for good enough has simply slipped, probably without anyone consciously deciding it should. The way out, following Meadows, is to maintain absolute standards for quality. This might mean using automated code quality checks, mandatory code coverage percentages, strict linting rules that can't be easily bypassed. Even better, regularly revisit your best performance benchmarks, like what was our peak team velocity with minimal bugs, what was the lowest bug count in production during a specific release, and proactively integrate these quality dates into your CI/CD pipeline. This prevents the slow creep of technical degradation. This actively pulls your system towards higher quality rather than allowing it to passively descend into mediocrity. It's about building a system that pulls itself up, not just reacting constantly to its decay. Micro recap.
We're delving deeper into system traps on the deep dive, using Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems as our guide. Our last stop was drift to low performance, where goals erode due to a negative bias in perceiving past performance, leading to a continuous downward spiral, like that poor, slowly boiled frog. The critical insight is that the key to escaping isn't just trying harder, it's keeping standards absolute. And even better, using your best past achievements to actively pull the system up to higher and higher levels, turning a negative reinforcing loop into a powerful positive one.
Exactly. And speaking of spirals, our next archetype, escalation, describes a much faster, more dramatic kind of reinforcing loop, one that can quickly lead to extremes and eventual collapse, often in a competitive context. #escalation.
Next up, escalation. This is a powerful reinforcing feedback loop, where the state of one stock, say one competitor's arsenal or market share, is determined by trying to surpass the state of another stock, and vice versa. Think of it as a competitive arms race, where each side's action directly fuels an even stronger reaction from the other. It feels like a race to the bottom sometimes, or maybe just a race to extremes.
The mechanism is deceptively simple, often starting small. You hit me, so I hit you back a little harder. Then, oh yeah, well, you hit me harder, so I hit you back even harder. Each side, looking at the other's actions, perceives a threat or a challenge and responds with an increased effort or intensity. While each side might blame the other for initiating or perpetuating the cycle, they started it. Meadows points out that each side is fundamentally escalating itself. They are trapped in the structure. This self-reinforcing process builds exponentially. It carries the competition to extremes faster than anyone would believe possible and usually ends with the breakdown or collapse of one or both competitors. It's a classic example of individually rational actions leading to a collectively irrational, often destructive outcome.
Meadows gives us several powerful and very relatable examples of this destructive dynamic. The classic playground example of children fighting. One child pushes, the other pushes back harder, and soon both are engaged in a full-blown physical altercation, each trying to get the last word or the last blow in. The historical U.S.-Soviet arms race is a monumental, terrifying case. Years of exaggerated intelligence reports inflated perceptions of the other side's military capabilities. It led to trillions of dollars spent on weapon development, serious economic degradation of both superpowers, and the evolution of unimaginably destructive weapons. Each increase in armaments on one side caused a frantic scramble to surpass it on the other, creating a terrifying spiral.
A truly global scale escalation.
Yeah, absolutely. Then there's negative campaigning in politics. One candidate smears another, which provokes a retaliatory smear and so forth, until the public discourse degrades completely and voters lose faith in the entire democratic process. And price wars between economic competitors illustrate this in business. One company continually undercuts another's prices, leading the other to cut prices even more until both are selling at a loss and face potential bankruptcy. They get locked into this destructive cycle and find it incredibly hard to back out.
It's important to note, though, that escalation isn't inherently bad in terms of direction. It could theoretically be about positive things, peacefulness, civility, maybe efficiency, or even quality. However, even good escalation can become problematic precisely because it's incredibly hard to stop once it gains momentum. Meadows cites the example of hospitals trying to outdo each other with the latest, most expensive diagnostic machines and specialized facilities. Now, individually, that might seem rational for each hospital trying to attract patients and doctors. But collectively, this leads to out-of-sight healthcare costs that burden the entire system. So even if the direction seems positive, uncontrolled exponential growth can still lead to unsustainable and undesirable outcomes.
So if you're caught in this kind of accelerating spiral, whether it's good or bad escalation, what does Meadows suggest for breaking free? It sounds like you need to actively defy the system's own reinforcing logic.
You absolutely do. The logic of the system keeps pulling you further in. Meadows identifies two main ways out, and both are quite counterintuitive within the logic of the escalating system. The first is unilateral disarmament. This involves one party deliberately reducing its own system state, say, reducing armaments, stopping negative campaigning, or pulling back on a price cut in the hope of inducing reductions in the competitor's state.
Wow. That sounds incredibly risky. You make yourself vulnerable.
It is incredibly risky. It's counterintuitive because it involves a short-term competitive disadvantage. You're basically hoping the other side doesn't just take advantage of your pullback. However, Meadows notes it can work if done with determination, provided you can survive that initial period of vulnerability. It's a gamble, really, on the other side reciprocating, on breaking the cycle.
A leap of faith, almost. Okay, what's the other option?
The second, and often more palatable, or at least more structured option, is to negotiate a disarmament. This involves a fundamental structural change, creating a new system with balancing control loops, specifically designed to keep the competition in bounds. To manage the escalation, examples include parental pressure stepping in to stop a children's fight, or regulations on advertising to prevent excessive intrusion and noise, or the deployment of international peacekeeping troops in conflict zones. These all introduce external balancing forces. Meadows acknowledges that such agreements are usually not easy to get, and they're rarely pleasing to all parties because they require compromise and a relinquishing of some competitive advantage or freedom. However, they are far better than remaining locked in a destructive, mutually assured race to the bottom or to unsustainable extremes.
Okay, so for our software engineering audience, what's the aha moment with escalation? How does this competitive spiral manifest in our tech teams, maybe between projects or platforms, and how can we disarm or negotiate our way out?
Right. The aha here is realizing that many internal wars, whether they're over features, tooling choices, or even perceived team status or headcount, are often direct manifestations of escalation. Imagine a feature creep phenomenon where one team adds a complex feature, maybe with its own bespoke logging and monitoring. So Team B feels compelled to build an even more complex one, perhaps with a competing observability stack, just to keep up or look innovative. This leads to an ever-growing, often unmaintainable codebase and fragmented internal systems. Nobody wins in the long run.
Or maybe competing internal frameworks.
Exactly. Competing internal frameworks where each tries to outdo the other in perceived elegance or completeness. This leads to fragmented ecosystems, duplication of effort, developers having to learn multiple ways of doing the same thing. It's like two developers locked in a prettier config war, endlessly tweaking indentation rules until no one can read the code anymore. Except, with much higher stakes for the organization. The critical insight is that if left unchecked, this kind of internal competition can cripple an organization through redundant effort and increasing complexity. The way out. It could be unilateral simplification, one team deliberately reducing its own complexity or feature scope to encourage others to follow suit, taking that risky first step. Or, more effectively, negotiating a shared architectural vision and common guidelines across teams. This prevents feature or tooling escalation. It might involve standardizing on a single logging solution, agreeing on a core set of shared libraries, or establishing clear boundaries for service ownership. This introduces a balancing loop to control those competitive impulses and align efforts towards a coherent, maintainable system for everyone. Micro recap. You're listening to The Deep Dive. We just explored the escalation trap, a powerful reinforcing feedback loop where competition intensifies exponentially, often leading to mutual destruction or unsustainable extremes. We saw how this plays out in everything from arms races to internal tooling wars, and the critical insight is that the solutions require breaking the reinforcing cycle, either by unilaterally stepping back risky, or by negotiating new balancing controls to manage the competition and introduce stability.
Absolutely. And speaking of competition, our next trap, success to the successful, reveals how initial wins can bake in a system that inherently ensures the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, fundamentally altering the playing field over time. It's a tough one. Hashtag success to the successful competitive exclusion. Let's turn to success to the successful, also known as competitive exclusion. This is a, frankly, profoundly unfair system trap where the winners of a competition receive, as part of their reward, the means to compete even more effectively in the future. It's a mechanism that structurally reinforces initial advantages, making it harder and harder for others to catch up.
This creates a really powerful reinforcing feedback loop, often leading to exponential divergence between winners and losers. The more a winner wins, the more they can win, as their victories compound their resources, their power, or their influence. And if this competition occurs in a limited environment like a market with finite customers or an ecosystem with finite resources, Meadows explains that everything the winner gains is essentially extracted from the losers. The losers are gradually bankrupted, forced out, or starved of the resources they need to compete effectively. This mechanism is perfectly illustrated by the board game Monopoly, right? The players who get hotels early accumulate far more wealth from rent, which they then use to buy more properties and build more hotels, systematically eliminating the other players.
Right. Once you fall behind in Monopoly, it's really hard to come back.
Almost impossible. Another simpler example Meadows gives is a neighborhood Christmas lights contest, where the first winner used their $100 prize money to buy more lights. They won again the next year, bought even more lights, and won repeatedly until the contest had to be suspended because it was inherently unfair. The initial win gave them the resources to guarantee future wins. The biblical quote, "For he that hath, to him shall be given, and he that hath not, from him shall be taken even that which he hath," captures this dynamic perfectly. It's an ancient observation about how systems can concentrate advantage.
This concept is also well established in ecology as the competitive exclusion principle. Basically, two species cannot live in the exact same ecological niche, competing for the exact same resources indefinitely. One will inevitably reproduce or utilize resources just slightly more efficiently, gaining a small reinforcing advantage. This dominant species then systematically appropriates all the shared resources, effectively driving the other to extinction. Not necessarily by direct confrontation, but just by outcompeting them for the very means of survival.
And Karl Marx applied a similar analysis to capitalism. He noted that two firms in the same market will exhibit behavior similar to competing species. One gains a slight advantage, maybe through greater efficiency, smarter investment, better technology, and systematically eliminates competition, leading eventually to market consolidation. We've seen this repeatedly throughout history. Think about the reduction of many automobile companies down to just a few giants, or how many local newspapers have consolidated down to just one, maybe two, in most major U.S. cities. The inherent logic of unchecked competition in this view leads towards monopoly.
But the most damaging aspect, Meadows points out, and this is really sobering, is how this trap perpetuates deep-seated inequality. It creates a chasm between the privileged and the disadvantaged across various societal dimensions. In education, the poorest children typically receive the worst-funded, lowest-quality education, which limits their marketable skills and helps perpetuate poverty across generations. Regarding capital and borrowing, low-income individuals often lack assets and collateral, so they can't borrow from most banks at reasonable rates. This forces them either to forego crucial investments, like starting a business or getting training, or to resort to high-interest moneylenders, making it almost impossible to accumulate wealth.
Trapped again.
It's exactly. In terms of land ownership, in many parts of the world, land is held so unevenly that most farmers are tenants. They pay rent to landowners, yet preventing them from saving enough to buy their own land, while the landowners use that income to buy even more land. On purchasing power, the poor, who can often only afford to buy small quantities of goods, frequently pay higher unit prices. They're effectively penalized for their limited means. And tragically, in areas of disease and pollution, the poor are frequently exposed to dangerous low-paying jobs, lack access to vaccinations, and live in crowded, crime-prone, and polluted areas. They bear the brunt of societal externalities. These are all reinforcing feedback loops that systematically funnel resources away from those who need them most and towards those who already have an advantage.
It's a bleak picture when you lay it out like that. So Meadows asks, how do you break out of this insidious trap? How do you stop the rich from automatically getting richer at the expense of the poor? One way, she mentions, is diversification. Species or companies can sometimes escape direct competition by exploiting new resources or creating entirely new products or services that don't directly compete with the dominant players. This allows them to carve out a new niche where they can survive and maybe thrive.
Find a different game to play.
Essentially, yes. Find a different game. However, this isn't guaranteed to work, especially if dominant entities have the power to crush or simply acquire successful offshoots. And moreover, diversification is rarely a viable strategy for individuals trapped in systemic poverty. They often lack the resources or opportunities to simply diversify.
Right. So if you can't beat them, find a new game. But what if there isn't a new game, or the dominant players control all the games? What then?
That's where the other strategies come in. Another approach is limiting the win. This involves implementing feedback loops that prevent any single competitor from taking over entirely. Think of antitrust laws designed to break up monopolies or prevent anti-competitive mergers. Though Meadows wryly notes that winning companies often gain enough political power to influence and weaken the administration of these very laws, making this a constant battle between competitive forces and regulatory balancing loops.
So the winners try to rewrite the rules of the game in their favor.
Often, yes. Which leads to Meadows' preferred path, especially for societal equity, leveling the playing field. This involves policies that actively remove advantages from the strongest players or actively increase the advantages of the weakest, aiming to create a more equitable competition from the start. To give everyone a better chance, examples she gives include progressive income tax and inheritance tax, which redistribute wealth from the rich to fund public services or reduce burdens on the poor. Universal high-quality public education and public welfare programs aim to provide a baseline of opportunity for everyone. Labor unions offer collective bargaining power to workers, helping to balance the power dynamic with employers. And interestingly, she mentions traditional gift-giving cultures, like the potlatch ceremonies of indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, which acted as inherent redistribution mechanisms, preventing excessive wealth accumulation by mandating that leaders give away wealth to maintain status.
That's fascinating. Okay, the aha moment for a software engineer, then, is recognizing that success to the successful isn't just about market dominance between companies. It happens within our organizations, too, right? How does this manifest in tech companies, and how can we try to level that internal playing field?
Exactly. The aha is realizing that talent, budget, and opportunities don't always flow to where they're most needed for the overall health of the organization. They often flow to where success is already being demonstrated, creating a self-reinforcing loop of advantage inside the company. This might manifest in the dominance of a single, well-resourced team or project, maybe the one working on the newest, flashiest product, which continuously receives more talent, larger budgets, and preferential access to critical resources or leadership attention. Meanwhile, other valuable initiatives, perhaps maintaining critical infrastructure or improving internal tooling, are starved and struggle to gain traction.
The golden child project syndrome.
That's a great way to put it. The Golden Child project gets all the senior engineers and budget, while equally important but less visible foundational work languishes. The success of the Golden Child generates resources that allow it to attract more resources, excluding other areas. The way out, or ways to mitigate this, could involve implementing internal venture capital programs. These could specifically fund innovative new projects from smaller, less visible teams, giving them a fighting chance to demonstrate value. Or maybe mandating open source contributions within the company, requiring successful teams to share their knowledge and tools across the organization, breaking down information silos. Fostering cross-team rotations can also help. It spreads expertise and reduces information hoarding, thereby leveling the internal playing field somewhat, ensuring that crucial knowledge isn't bottlenecked within just one successful team. It's about designing internal systems that promote equitable opportunity and knowledge sharing, not just rewarding existing, visible success. Micro recap.
We're deep in the weeds of system archetypes on the deep dive, using Donella Meadows' framework. We just discussed success to the successful, where early wins generate more wins, creating a widening gap between winners and losers. We explored how this plays out from board games to economic structures, and critically, how it can manifest within organizations, favoring certain teams or projects. The key insight: strategies like diversification, limiting the win, and actively leveling the playing field are crucial for countering this powerful reinforcing loop.
Exactly. And our final two traps, shifting the burden to the intervener and rule beating, offer equally critical insights, particularly for those of us navigating complex technical systems. They highlight how well-intentioned solutions can ironically create new, perhaps even more dangerous problems down the line. Hashtag shifting the burden to the intervener addiction.
Okay, now for shifting the burden to the intervener, which Meadows chillingly equates to addiction. This trap occurs when a problem is solved, usually temporarily, by an external intervention. But that intervention, perhaps inadvertently, undermines the original system's capacity to maintain itself, leading to growing, often unseen, dependency. Use the analogy of using a crutch for so long that your leg muscles atrophy. That feels right.
That crutch analogy is perfect, I think. Imagine you're a software engineer, or maybe a team, overwhelmed by a mountain of technical debt. Instead of engaging in the hard, long-term solution, disciplined refactoring, implementing robust testing, improving architecture, you repeatedly rely on a single, brilliant hero developer to swoop in and fix critical bugs during emergencies.
The firefighter.
Exactly, the firefighter. The immediate problem is solved, right? The fire is out, everyone feels relief, but the underlying system, the poor code quality, the lack of testing, the insufficient architecture that caused the fire remains fundamentally unaddressed. It might even get worse because no one's paying attention to it. Meadows explains that the intervention, whether by actively destroying the system's own capabilities or simply by neglecting them, causes the original capacity to atrophy. The system deteriorates further. Then, more of the intervention is needed next time the fire breaks out. The dependence deepens, creating a vicious cycle. Meadows vividly uses the Alcoholics Anonymous definition of the addiction cycle. Repeating the same stupid behavior over and over and over and somehow expecting different results. It's about finding that quick fix to a symptom, which prevents or distracts from solving the real underlying problem.
The source provides numerous examples that illustrate this dependency dynamic across different domains. Drug addiction is the clearest parallel. Drugs alter one's perception of a problem, like feeling tireless or brave, without addressing the real situation, often making the underlying issues worse in the long run. Government subsidies can prop up ineffective companies or industries without forcing the fundamental improvements needed for them to be competitive on their own. In agriculture, applying chemical fertilizers might give you a bumper crop this year, providing immediate relief, but without improving fundamental soil fertility, it leads to future reliance on increasingly more fertilizer as the soil degrades.
Right, you're treating the symptom, not the soil health.
Exactly. The widespread use of calculators has, for many people, eroded fundamental mental arithmetic skills. We've shifted the burden to the device. And modern medicine in general, Meadows argues, has sometimes shifted the responsibility for health away from individual lifestyle practices and preventative care, placing it onto doctors and pharmaceutical interventions. We look for a pill instead of changing our habits.
This trap is so insidious precisely because the intervention often works initially. It provides that welcome, immediate relief to the symptom, which strongly reinforces the problematic behavior. See, the intervention worked. Meadows illustrates this with powerful examples. Consider pesticides. Rather than fundamentally examining farming methods like monocultures or the destruction of natural pest controls that might have led to the pest outlook in the first place, pesticides are applied. The bugs go away temporarily. Success. But this immediate success enables farmers to plant even more monocultures, which in turn brings the bugs back in greater outbursts later on because their natural predators have also been killed off. This requires more and more pesticides in a perpetual escalating cycle. The intervention weakens the system's natural resilience.
Wow. Okay, another example.
Sure. Think about oil price caps. When faced with rising energy costs, instead of addressing the fundamental issue, the inevitable depletion of a non-renewable resource, which would require systemic changes like improving fuel efficiency or developing alternative fuels, governments sometimes cap prices. This strategy pretends nothing is happening. It encourages continued burning of cheap oil, which only worsens the depletion problem. When this policy inevitably breaks down because the shortages become too severe, it can lead to more drastic measures, like going to war for oil or frantically searching for new deposits in sensitive areas, further delaying the necessary systemic change. The quick fix prevents, or at least postpones, the hard, long-term solution.
So the aha for us here, Meadows would say, is to be incredibly wary of easy answers, of those quick fixes that seem too good to be true. What are the ways out of this addictive loop? How do we break the dependency?
Exactly. Be wary of the crutch. Meadows provides critical guidance. First, and ideally, avoid getting in altogether. Be extremely wary of policies or practices that offer only short-term relief without addressing the root cause of the problem. Instead, focus your energy on long-term restructuring and building the system's inherent capabilities. Second, if you are the intervener, maybe you're that hero developer or consultant, your role should be to work in such a way as to restore or even enhance the system's own ability to solve its problems. Then, you need to gradually remove yourself, allowing the system to stand on its own feet. Your goal should be to make yourself unnecessary.
That requires a different mindset from just fixing the problem.
A completely different mindset. And third, if you are dependent, if your team relies on that Shiro or that external tool, the onus is on you to proactively build your system's own capabilities before completely removing the intervention. Meadows notes this might involve gradual, stepped approaches, or in some dire cases, maybe going cold turkey and enduring some intense withdrawal symptoms. But the longer you wait, the more the system atrophies and the harder and more painful the withdrawal process will be.
Okay, so for software teams, what does this look like in practice? Are we becoming addicted to hot fixes or maybe certain external dependencies or frameworks?
Oh, this is highly relevant for software teams. The aha moment here is to honestly recognize when your team or organization is becoming addicted to external fixes or temporary solutions that prevent true growth and resilience. Are you becoming addicted to deploying hot fixes late on Friday night instead of addressing the root cause of recurring bugs through better testing, clearer requirements, or architectural improvements during the week? Are you over-relying on external consultants or maybe a complex off-the-shelf framework to solve problems that your team should be building internal capacity and understanding for? This leads to a team that becomes less self-sufficient, more reliant on external dependencies, and ultimately less resilient and less knowledgeable about its own systems. It erodes internal expertise. Meadows urges you to proactively build internal capabilities. Invest in the fundamentals training, better tooling, time for refactoring. Design your system and your processes so they aren't constantly dependent on external fixes that just mask underlying structural weaknesses. The goal is to make the system resilient and self-sustaining. Hashtag rule beating.
Our penultimate trap, rule beating, is one that I suspect software engineers know very well, perhaps from personal experience on either side of the rule. It highlights the often perverse outcomes of trying to impose rigid control on complex systems. This is when rules designed to govern a system lead to perverse behavior, giving the appearance of obeying the rules or achieving stated goals, but actually distorting the system in unintended and often counterproductive ways.
That's a great description. This often arises when lower levels in a hierarchy respond to rules coming from above that are overly rigid, maybe unworkable in practice, or perhaps ill-defined and ambiguous. The people operating within the system, faced with conflicting pressures or unrealistic targets set by the rules, find clever ways to meet the letter of the law without adhering to its spirit. They're smart enough to find loopholes or perverse workarounds that satisfy the metrics imposed upon them, even if those actions actively detract from the overall purpose the rules were supposed to serve.
Right. Malicious compliance almost. Meadows offers some compelling examples of this phenomenon. In budget spending, managers often feel compelled to spend their entire allocated budget by the end of the fiscal year, even on unnecessary things. Why? Just to avoid being allocated less money next year, the implicit rule becomes spend your budget, not necessarily spend wisely to achieve the mission. Vermont's Act 250 in the 1970s was a state land use law requiring complex, costly environmental reviews for subdivisions of 10 acres or less. The unintended result: an extraordinary number of lots, just a little over 10 acres, as developers skillfully designed their subdivisions to bypass the regulation entirely.
They beat the rule.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
In the European feed grain restrictions of the 1960s, import restrictions were placed on corn, intended to help local European grain farmers. But this led importers to simply shift to importing massive quantities of cassava from Asia, which wasn't restricted but served a similar purpose, undermining the original intent to support local grain. And chillingly, the U.S. Endangered Species Act, which restricts development on land where endangered species habitat is found, has allegedly led some landowners to purposely hunt or poison endangered species on their property before they are officially discovered. Why? To remove the legal obstacle to development, a truly perverse outcome.
Meadows warns that the standard response to rule beating, which is often to try to stamp out this self-organizing perverse behavior by strengthening the rules, adding more clauses, or increasing enforcement, usually just leads to even greater system distortion. It's a downward spiral. Stricter rules lead to more clever rule beating, which leads to even stricter rules, and so on. The system becomes increasingly unmanageable, bureaucratic, and dysfunctional. That's the way deeper into the trap because it ignores the fundamental feedback signal. The rules themselves are generating unintended consequences.
So it's not just about developers being lazy or non-compliant when they say find ways around cumbersome coding standards. It's potentially a critical signal that the rules themselves might be broken, poorly designed, or misaligned with reality. What then does Meadows tell us for escaping this cycle of perverse outcomes?
That's the precise aha moment. The fundamental way out is to stop seeing rule beating as just bad behavior, and instead understand it as useful feedback about the inadequacy or inappropriateness of the rules themselves or the way they are being applied. It's a signal from the system. This means you must revise and improve the rules, maybe rescind them, simplify them, clarify them, or better explain the purpose behind them based on the feedback received from the rule-beating behavior. Even more importantly, Meadows stresses, you must design for positive self-organization. Structure rules in a way that turns the inherent cleverness and self-organizing capabilities of the people in the system in a positive direction. Align the rules with the purpose, not just the literal interpretation. The goal is to unleash creativity towards the desired outcome, not channel it into finding ways to circumvent the system.
Okay. So how does this translate into software engineering practice? Where do we typically see rule beating, and how can we use that behavior as valuable feedback instead of just cracking down?
Right. For software engineers, this might be seen when, for example, strict coding standards are enforced without clear rationale, or maybe without considering the practicalities of developer workflows. This can lead developers to find clever ways to bypass static analysis tools or linting rules, littering the code with NOPMD or ESLint disable comments to ignore warnings without fixing the underlying issue. Or maybe committing code that only superficially meets standards through obscure practices that actually make the code harder to understand. The opportunity here is to listen to why developers are bypassing the rules. Don't just assume laziness. Recognize it as feedback. Maybe the rules are too rigid for certain contexts. Maybe they're impractical. Maybe they conflict with other goals like speed of delivery. Maybe the value of the rule isn't clear. Instead of just adding more checks or tightening enforcement, engage with the feedback. Adapt the rules or the process surrounding them to genuinely foster better code quality, usability, or maintainability in a practical way, rather than just aiming for superficial compliance. This means evolving the rules in concert with the system's natural tendency to self-organize, allowing for flexibility within a shared purpose and understanding. #TAC seeking the wrong goal.
Finally, we arrive at our last trap, seeking the wrong goal. This trap highlights something really fundamental. System behavior is profoundly sensitive to the goals embedded within its feedback loops. What you measure and reward dictates what the system does. If these goals, the indicators of satisfaction, the metrics you track, are inaccurately or incompletely defined, the system may obediently work its heart out to produce a result that is not truly intended or wanted, often with perverse, unintended consequences.
Meadows states it very bluntly, and it's worth repeating. Systems have a terrible tendency to produce exactly and only what you ask them to produce, so Meadows emphasizes, be careful what you ask them to produce. This often involves a fundamental and surprisingly common mistake, confusing effort with result. We define a proxy metric because it's easy to measure, we optimize the system to maximize that proxy, and then we wonder why the real problem we cared about persists or even gets worse.
So it's about misdirected optimization. The system achieves the target but misses the point entirely. Consider these potent examples from the source material. If national security is defined primarily by the amount of money spent on the military, well, the system will diligently produce military spending. Budgets will increase, contracts will be awarded. But this may not actually produce real national security, especially if it drains vital investment from other economic sectors like education or infrastructure, or if the spending goes towards exorbitant, ineffective, or unworkable weapons systems. The metric is met. The goal might not be. Similarly, if good education is measured solely by money spent per student or by standardized test scores, the system will ensure these metrics are met. Schools will focus intensely on test prep, administrators will fight for funding per head. But whether this correlates with actual good education, critical thinking, creativity, civic engagement, well-rounded individuals is highly questionable.
Teaching to the test.
Exactly. Teaching to the test, not necessarily teaching the child. In the early days of family planning in India, program goals were defined very narrowly by the number of IUDs implanted. This led to doctors, under pressure to meet their targets, allegedly implanting IUDs into women without proper patient approval or consultation. A horrific outcome that completely undermined the program's actual purpose of empowering women and promoting healthy families. They hit the target, but destroyed the mission.
Meadows singles out the widespread adoption of gross national product, GNP, or its close cousin GDP, as the primary measure of national economic success as perhaps the worst, most pervasive mistake of this kind. It's a systemic goal that she argues has had far-reaching and detrimental consequences globally. Robert F. Kennedy famously articulated its shortcomings back in 1968, stating that GNP measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. It counts pollution in prisons, but not health, education, or the beauty of our poetry. This powerful critique highlights how GNP fundamentally fails to capture human well-being, environmental quality, social cohesion, or the true value of life.
It sounds like it just tracks economic activity, any activity, good or bad, not actual welfare or progress.
Precisely. What GNP actually measures is throughput. It's the total monetary value of the flows of stuff made and purchased in a year. It doesn't measure capital stocks, the real lasting wealth like our infrastructure, our skills, our houses, cars, computers, or crucially, our healthy ecosystems and natural resources. It measures effort and gross production and consumption, not efficiency, not sustainability, not equity, not actual well-being. This leads to perverse incentives. Meadows notes that highly efficient new light bulbs that use 1/8 the electricity and last 10 times longer actually make GNP go down. Why? Because they reduce the throughput of energy sales and replacement bulb purchases.
That's crazy. Something good makes the key metric go down.
Isn't it? So governments, often fixated on growing GNP as their primary goal, can be incentivized to stimulate wasteful production or encourage short-term exploitation of resources, like overharvesting forests or depleting fisheries that undermine the long-term good of the economy, society, and environment. They are optimizing for a metric that is fundamentally divorced from true, sustainable welfare.
That's a truly profound aha moment. A system will always give you exactly what you ask for, even if that's not what you really want or need. So what does this all mean for setting the right goals and avoiding this trap? How do we aim the system correctly?
Meadows is very clear on this. You must specify indicators and goals that genuinely reflect the real welfare of the system. This requires deep, careful thought about what truly matters, beyond easily quantifiable proxies or simple activity measures. And critically, you must be extremely careful not to confuse effort with result. If your goals are defined by activities or intermediate outputs like hours worked, lines of code written, number of meetings held, money spent, your system will obediently produce only that effort. It won't necessarily produce the desired outcome, like valuable working software, satisfied customers, or genuine learning.
Okay, so for software engineers then, where do we typically fall into the seeking the wrong goal trap with our metrics and incentives? What should we be measuring instead to ensure we're building the right things and having the right impact?
Oh, this trap is profoundly relevant, maybe the most relevant, to setting project metrics and team incentives in software development. The aha for engineers is realizing that the metrics you choose to chase will absolutely dictate your team's behavior, for better or for worse. What gets measured gets managed and often gamed. If you measure and reward lines of code written or maybe number of JRA tickets closed, you might indeed get more lines of code and more closed tickets. But you won't necessarily get more valuable features delivered to users or more stable and maintainable software for the long term. You've optimized for effort, or maybe just churn, not for the actual result you presumably care about.
Right. Velocity without value.
Exactly. Velocity without value or closing bugs without improving quality. The opportunity here is to define goals that truly reflect business value, user satisfaction, system reliability, or maybe long-term maintainability. And then, this is the crucial part, design your feedback loops, your metrics, your incentives, your reporting structures around those real goals. For example, instead of as bugs close, perhaps measure mean time to recovery, MTTR, for critical incidents, or customer reported defect rate. Instead of just features shipped or story points completed, perhaps measure user adoption rate for new features, customer satisfaction scores, CS@, tied to specific product areas, or even lead time for changes as a measure of true agility. This shifts the system's focus from mere activity to meaningful impact. It guides the system and the people within it toward truly desired outcomes rather than just optimizing proxies that might lead you astray. End of chapter mega recap plus flashcard bullet list for chapter 5.
Wow. What a profound journey through these system traps. It feels like we've really uncovered some hidden machinery behind why things go wrong. From policy resistance, where conflicting goals lead to frustrating stalemates, to the tragedy of the commons, where individually rational actions ruin shared resources. Then, the insidious erosion of goals and drift to low performance, causing that slow, steady decline, followed by escalating conflicts and spiral wildly out of control. We also saw how success to the successful can bake in inequality, making the rich richer. The dangers of relying on external fixes and shifting the burden, leading to addiction. Then the pitfalls of rule beating, where rigid rules lead to perverse compliance. And finally, the profound trap of pursuing the wrong goals entirely. These archetypes truly highlight the hidden, often counterintuitive, dynamics of complex systems, don't they?
They really do. It's like having a diagnostic toolkit for systemic problems. For easy retention and application in your own work, especially in software, think of these as mental flashcards. Let's quickly condense these powerful insights. First, policy resistance or fixes that fail. The trap. Policies keep getting resisted. The system stubbornly returns to an undesirable state despite huge effort. Feels like pushing on a rope. The root cause. Conflicting goals among different subsystems or actors. Everyone's pulling in different directions, creating a stalemate. The way out. Maybe let go of ineffective policies. More powerfully, find ways to align the various goals around a shared, overarching purpose that everyone can genuinely buy into. Second, tragedy of the commons. The trap. A shared, limited resource gets overused and degraded, eventually becoming useless for everyone. The root cause. Weak or delayed feedback from the resource's condition back to the individual users. Benefits are concentrated individually and immediately. Costs are diffused collectively and over time. The way out. Educate users, yes, but critically restore or strengthen the missing feedback, either by privatizing the resource so each user feels direct consequences, or, more often, by regulating access for all users, that mutual coercion mutually agreed upon. Third, drift to low performance, or eroding goals boiled frog. The trap. Performance standards subtly, continuously decline over time. Things just keep getting worse, slowly. The root cause. A negative bias in perceiving past performance. Bad results stick, good results are dismissed, leading to gradual lowering of desired standards and less corrective action. The way out. Keep performance standards absolute and fixed. Don't let them drift down with performance. Even better, make goals sensitive to the best past performances, using past peaks to actively pull the system towards higher achievement. Fourth, escalation. The trap. A competitive arms race where each party tries to surpass the state of the other, leading to exponential growth in intensity and potential collapse. The root cause. A reinforcing feedback loop where each action by one party triggers an even stronger counteraction from the other. I hit you harder because you hit me harder. The way out. Risky option. Unilateral disarmament. Refuse to compete. Step back. More stable option. Negotiate a new system with balancing control loops to manage and bound the competition. Rules, regulations, treaties. Fifth, success to the successful or competitive exclusion. The trap. Winners of a competition are systematically rewarded with the means to win even more effectively in the future. Leads to increasing inequality and elimination of losers. The rich get richer. The root cause. A powerful reinforcing feedback loop where advantage, wealth, power, resources accumulates, systematically disadvantaging those who start behind or fall behind. The way out. Encourage diversification. Help losers find new games. Implement strict limits on the fraction of the pie any one winner can take, like antitrust. And critically for society, implement policies that level the playing field, progressive taxes, education, welfare unions. Sixth, shifting the burden to the intervener or addiction, the trap. A problem is solved by an external intervention, but this fix weakens the system's own capacity to maintain itself, leading to growing dependency. The crutch weakens the leg, the root cause. A quick fix addresses a symptom, providing relief. This prevents focus on the underlying problem, and the original system's self-maintenance capability atrophies, requiring more intervention over time. The way out. Avoid symptom-relieving policies that don't address root causes. Focus on long-term structural change. If you're the intervener, aim to build the system's capacity and make yourself unnecessary. If dependent, build your own capabilities before removing the crutch. Seventh, rule beating, the trap. Rules designed to govern a system lead to perverse behavior. Actors meet the letter but violate the spirit of the law, distorting the system's purpose, the root cause. Often a response from lower levels to overly rigid, unworkable, or ill-defined rules imposed from above. People find workarounds, the way out. See rule beating as useful feedback. Don't just tighten the rules. Revise, improve, clarify, or rescind the rules. Design rules that align the system's cleverness and self-organizing capabilities with the true purpose of the rules. And finally, eighth, seeking the wrong goal, the trap. The system diligently produces results, but they are unintended or unwanted outcomes. It hits the target but misses the point, the root cause. The goals or indicators used in the system's feedback loops are inaccurately or incompletely defined. Often happens when we confuse easily measured effort or activity with the actual desired result or outcome, the way out. Specify indicators and goals that genuinely reflect the real welfare or purpose of the system. Be extremely careful not to measure and optimize for effort, activity, or proxy metrics instead of the ultimate outcome you truly care about.
That's a fantastic summary. You can really see how each of these traps, while they seem distinct, often intertwine and amplify each other in the real world. It makes system dynamics truly complex, but also understandable with these patterns. This kind of holistic thinking, the ability to see the underlying structures rather than just reacting to events or blaming individuals, can give you a profound advantage. An advantage in understanding and maybe even shaping the world around you, whether it's your personal habits, your team dynamics, or a massive software project. Outro. What an incredible deep dive into the hidden forces that shape our systems. Understanding these traps isn't just, academic. It feels like a critical skill for anyone aiming to create lasting positive change, especially in dynamic and interconnected fields like software engineering.
Absolutely. Knowing these archetypes allows you to diagnose problems differently, not as failures of individuals or just random bad luck, but as symptoms of underlying problematic system structures. For you, the software engineer listening, this means recognizing why that technical debt keeps piling up despite occasional refactoring efforts, or why your team's velocity is consistently underprojected even with experienced members, or why new processes or tools seem to get ignored or actively subverted. It empowers you to look beyond the surface explanations.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? The next time you encounter a persistent, frustrating problem in your code base, your project, your team, or your organization, don't just troubleshoot the immediate symptom or look for someone to blame. Instead, pause and ask yourself, which system trap, or maybe combination of traps, am I seeing here? Is it policy resistance, preventing a needed refactor of a legacy system because different stakeholders have conflicting goals? Is it a tragedy of the commons emerging in your shared infrastructure where everyone uses it but no one feels responsible for maintaining it?
Is it a drift to low performance and code quality where standards have slowly, almost imperceptibly, slipped over time? Or perhaps are you seeking the wrong goal by optimizing for metrics that don't truly deliver value, like just counting story points instead of measuring customer impact? Identifying the archetype is really a crucial first step toward finding a real structural solution.
And this raises an important question, a challenge really. How can you, as an individual contributing to these complex software systems, leverage this knowledge? How can you push for structural change rather than just endlessly patching symptoms? Perhaps by identifying the missing or delayed feedback loops in your team's processes and suggesting ways to strengthen them. Perhaps by advocating for clear and aligned goals that reflect true user value, not just internal activity metrics. Or maybe by designing systems, both technical and social, that foster intrinsic responsibility among developers for the health and resilience of the entire code base and product. The real power, I think, is in seeing the system, not just the code, and understanding that you, even as an individual contributor, have the agency to influence its structure for the better.
That's our deep dive for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of Donella Meadows' thinking in systems and these fascinating system traps. We really hope this conversation helps you see your world and the systems within it with a new, more insightful lens.
And remember, the world is a continuum full of interconnected systems. The more ways of seeing, the more tools you have for understanding, the better equipped you are. Until next time, keep thinking in systems.